In Episode 5, titled Fast Recall System, Turning Objectives into Mental Checklists, the goal is to build memory cues that trigger the right checklist fast, especially when a scenario question feels busy and your attention is being pulled in multiple directions. Most people think they need more content, but what they usually need is faster retrieval because the exam rewards the ability to recall the right concept at the right moment. A mental checklist is not a gimmick. It is a compressed decision tool that brings order to a prompt and prevents you from skipping the obvious. When your checklists are consistent, you spend less time searching your memory and more time evaluating the choices in front of you. That is how you turn exam objectives into something you can actually use under time pressure. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CloudNet X books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start by chunking topics into small checklists you can recite in order, because large, unstructured piles of knowledge are hard to access when you are stressed. Chunking means you take a broad objective and reduce it into a handful of steps that reliably cover the important decision points without wandering into trivia. The steps should be few enough that you can keep them in working memory, but complete enough that they protect you from missing a critical constraint or requirement. When you can recite a checklist in order, you are rehearsing an internal sequence that your brain can follow automatically, which reduces mental friction. A good checklist also creates a sense of progress, because you can tell where you are in the reasoning process instead of feeling lost. In practice, chunking is how you convert know everything into do this sequence, which is far more usable on exam day. Use one verb per checklist step, because verbs keep recall active and prevent your checklist from turning into a passive list of nouns that you recognize but cannot apply. Verbs force action in your mind, such as classify, identify, verify, compare, eliminate, or validate, and each verb implies a specific mental move. When your steps are verb-driven, you are less likely to freeze, because you always know what to do next, even if the scenario is unfamiliar. Verbs also help you avoid overthinking, because the checklist becomes a process, not a debate. If a step is just a noun, like security, it is too broad, and it will not trigger the right behavior. But a verb, like reduce trust or narrow access, tells you exactly what to look for. Over time, these verbs become cues that activate the associated mental models quickly and reliably. Anchor each checklist to a scenario type you hear often, because memory retrieval is strongest when it is attached to a recognizable pattern. Scenario types might include remote access, hybrid connectivity, segmentation decisions, high availability needs, performance complaints, or cost control pressures, and each type tends to activate a predictable set of constraints. When you tie a checklist to a scenario type, the first sentence of the prompt often becomes the trigger, because you immediately recognize the category. This reduces the time you spend deciding which mental tool to use, which is a hidden source of exam fatigue. Anchoring also reduces confusion between similar topics, because each checklist has a home context that reminds you when it applies. In other words, you are not trying to recall everything at once. You are matching the prompt to a pattern and then running the checklist associated with that pattern. Add a quick warning step for the most common pitfall, because every objective has a way that candidates tend to misread it or over-apply it. The warning step should be short and specific, and it should trigger skepticism about the trap answer that looks attractive but violates the scenario's actual needs. For example, A pitfall might be assuming that adding more security tooling is always the best move, even when the scenario is primarily about performance or operational simplicity. Another pitfall might be treating a preference as a requirement and overbuilding a solution that creates cost and complexity without solving the goal. The warning step is not meant to scare you. It is meant to slow down impulsive selection at the moment it matters. When you bake the warning into the checklist, you do not have to remember it separately, and you get consistent protection from the same recurring traps. Practice retrieval, not rereading, by pausing before each answer attempt, because recognition is not the same as recall, and the exam demands recall under pressure. Rereading creates familiarity, which can feel like learning, but familiarity does not always translate into being able to produce the concept when you need it. Retrieval practice means you try to recall the checklist steps from memory before you look at the answer choices or before you commit to an option. That pause is important because it forces your brain to search actively, which strengthens memory pathways and makes future retrieval faster. Even a short pause can reveal what you truly know versus what you merely recognize, and that feedback is valuable. Over time, retrieval practice also reduces anxiety because you gain evidence that you can bring the right ideas to mind without prompting. Use spaced repetition by revisiting yesterday's checklist during warm-up minutes, because memory consolidation improves when you return to material after a delay, rather than cramming it all at once. Spaced repetition does not need to be complicated. It needs to be consistent, and even brief revisits can produce real gains. When you recall yesterday's checklist today, you are strengthening the retrieval path and reducing the forgetting curve that would otherwise erode your confidence. Warm-up minutes matter because they set your cognitive context, and starting with a quick recall builds momentum without draining energy. This approach also helps you notice which steps are weak because the parts you forget are the parts that need clearer wording or better anchors. In exam preparation, the goal is not to read more, it is to recall better, and spaced repetition is one of the most reliable ways to get there. Create a simple acronym only when it truly reduces confusion, because acronyms can either help or harm depending on whether they clarify sequencing or merely add another thing to memorize. An acronym is useful when the steps are stable, the order matters, and the letters map cleanly to verbs you can act on. If the acronym forces awkward wording or hides meaning behind clever letters, it becomes a liability, because you end up remembering the letters but forgetting what to do. In scenario reasoning, clarity beats cleverness, so an acronym should serve the checklist rather than dominate it. If you find yourself needing to explain the acronym to yourself every time, it is not reducing confusion, it is increasing it. The best acronyms are transparent triggers, not puzzles, and they should disappear into the background once the checklist becomes habit. Tie each step to a reason so it sticks longer, because memory is stronger when it is connected to purpose rather than rote sequence. A checklist step that has a rationale becomes easier to recall because you can reconstruct it even if the exact wording slips. For example, you might remember that you classify the environment first because controls and connectivity assumptions differ between cloud, on-premises, and hybrid contexts. You might remember that you identify the must-not-break constraint because it disqualifies options quickly and prevents wasted time on attractive but invalid choices. When every step has a reason, you also reduce the risk of applying the checklist mechanically in the wrong situation because the rationale reminds you what the step is protecting you from. This is how you move from memorization to understanding, and understanding is more durable under stress. On exam day, reasons act like mental glue, keeping the sequence intact when nerves try to pull it apart. Build contrast pairs, like allow list versus block list, for faster choices, because the exam often tests your ability to distinguish between closely related options. Contrast pairs work by sharpening boundaries so you can quickly tell which concept applies when the scenario provides a specific constraint. Allow list and block list are a useful example because they represent different default stances, different operational burdens, and different risk profiles, and the correct choice depends on context. Contrast pairs can also involve centralized versus distributed control, identity-first versus network-first gating, or redundancy versus simplicity, and each pair highlights trade-offs that show up repeatedly. When you practice contrast pairs, you train your brain to evaluate options by distinguishing features rather than by general impressions. This reduces hesitation because you have a pre-built comparison frame ready to use, and you can map scenario wording to the side of the pair that fits. Over time, contrast thinking becomes a shortcut to clarity, especially when two answers seem plausible. Use micro-quizzes by asking yourself 3 questions after each episode ends because small tests provide immediate retrieval practice without requiring a formal study session. The questions should target the checklist steps, the common pitfall warning, and the scenario anchor because those are the elements you want to trigger quickly during the exam. When you ask and answer your own questions, you create a loop where recall is attempted, checked, and strengthened, and that loop is what builds speed. Micro-quizzes also reveal whether your checklist is too long or too vague, because if you cannot answer quickly, the checklist needs refinement. This approach keeps learning active because you are producing answers rather than consuming content. Over time, those small checks compound, and you begin to trust your memory because you have repeatedly verified it in low-stakes moments. Keep a running review loop of recall, correct, and simplify wording, because checklists improve when they are treated as living tools rather than fixed scripts. Recall means you attempt the checklist from memory in the order you intend to use it, which tests whether it is truly retrievable. Correct means you compare what you recalled to what you intended, and you adjust any steps that are missing, redundant, or unclear. Simplify wording means you remove extra adjectives, tighten verbs, and make each step as clean as possible so it can be spoken internally in seconds. This loop prevents your system from getting bloated over time, which is a common failure mode when learners keep adding more detail instead of improving structure. A lean checklist is easier to recall, easier to apply, and less likely to be skipped when you are fatigued. The review loop is how you keep your recall system sharp and exam ready. For a mini review, recite today's checklist twice, then teach it aloud once, because teaching forces you to make the steps coherent and exposes gaps you might otherwise ignore. For a mini review, recite today's checklist twice, then teach it aloud once, because teaching forces you to make the steps coherent and exposes gaps you might otherwise ignore. For a mini review, recite today's checklist twice, then teach it aloud once, because teaching forces you to make the steps coherent and exposes gaps you might otherwise ignore. Reciting twice reinforces sequence, and the repetition helps you notice if a step feels unnatural or out of place, which usually means it should be rewritten. Teaching it aloud forces you to connect steps with brief reasons, which strengthens memory and ensures you can apply the checklist rather than merely repeat it. When you teach, you also practice pacing and clarity, which matters because your internal narration during the exam should be calm and structured. If you cannot explain a step simply, the step is too complex and will not survive time pressure. This mini-review is not about performance. It is about making the checklist feel inevitable, like the next step always makes sense given the last one. In the conclusion of Episode 5, titled Fast Recall System, Turning Objectives into Mental Checklists, the point is to make recall automatic so you can spend your exam energy on evaluation rather than on searching your memory. You build cues that trigger the right checklist quickly, chunk objectives into small recitable sequences, and write each step as a verb so your mind stays active. You anchor each checklist to a scenario type, add a warning step for the common pitfall, and practice retrieval through deliberate pauses rather than relying on rereading. You reinforce memory through spaced repetition, use acronyms only when they genuinely reduce confusion, and tie each step to a reason so it lasts longer. Pick one checklist and rehearse it on a walk, and you will feel the shift from knowing content to being able to use it on demand, which is exactly what exam performance requires. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.